What's up, ice babies? Thank you for joining me today. I have a treat for you. This channel is called We Need Ice. Anyone ever wondered where that came from? Well, my YouTube undertaking was born from an interesting story I'm honored to share with you. Actually, a historical tragedy I had not seen or heard many people cover before I got completely entrenched in it. And when I say not many, I mean it. I assure you, this is a rare and accurate look at an unfathomable event that took the lives of many brave young men and affected generations forever. I was extremely fortunate to have this story from a first-hand witness account handed to me in the hopes that I could do it justice in a journalistic sense, that I could tell the heartache and the triumph, that I could memorialize the lives lost while retaining the harrowing and courageous details of their last moments and the lives they led prior to, and that I could present it in a way that the audience would understand that these everyday heroes did not die in vain and their loved ones and community will never forget. The Kingman, Arizona BLEVE of 1973. I know. Many of you are scratching your heads, and that's fair. Trust me, if my radar had not been divinely intercepted with this story, I'd still be scratching mine. I had decided at the time of receiving the information that the best way I could achieve the goals of the victims, the witnesses, the survivors, and myself was to launch a podcast on the subject. That's what I did. You're actually looking at the front page of an issue of a Kingman, Arizona newspaper, which featured the We Need Ice podcast shortly after it was launched. But today, I'm allowing you to experience the story with me as a movie. Well, this first part will consist of episodes 1 and 2. We Need Ice, the podcast, is actually 13 episodes covering the Kingman BLEVE of 73. Producing videos from the material is a huge task, so I'd be so appreciative if you'd let me know that you'd like to continue watching this story here in video format. Subscribe now to get notified when videos are launched in chronological order, and of course, throw me a like, a share, whatever moves you. Get the discussion going in the comments, I'll engage. This is the Kingman, Arizona BLEVE of 1973 in long story format. Buckle up. This podcast contains sensitive and sometimes graphic details, information, and testimonials relating to burn injuries, burn victims, death, disaster survivors, and PTSD. Listener discretion is advised.
Attention citizens of Kingman, we need you now more than ever. The explosion, which you've all heard about, if not experienced firsthand, the victims, it's very bad. We need ice. Whatever you have in your freezer or at your business, please bring it to the Mojave County General Hospital. I repeat, the hospital needs ice. My God, these poor people. May God lay his hand on them and their families, and if anyone has.
On July 5th, 1973, the We Need Ice message was broadcast across a dedicated Kingman, Arizona radio station. The local hospital requesting ice cubes from residents' freezers? What on earth for? It was for the bodies, the dozens of human bodies burned alive from a railcar propane explosion, also known as a BLEVE. If you know anything about burn injuries, you know they are the most devastating to the body and the most excruciating in pain. The ice was for the bodies that were still alive, burning from the inside out. The true story I'm about to tell you will be painful to hear and hard to believe.
Do you remember, have you ever seen World War II, the big explosions where the mushroom clouds came down.
Yeah.
That's what it did. It was humongous. It hit children. It hit people. I think it was over 100 people injured.
That's my friend Kay, who lived in Kingman, Arizona during 1973, and during the BLEVE and topic of this podcast. She's real soft-spoken and, at times, a little emotional when retelling her version of these events. What you just heard her say was, "Have you seen World War II explosions? It was humongous. It hit children and people. I think there were over 100 people injured." Kay has stacks of Mojave County minor newspapers saved from the week of and those after the 73 BLEVE explosions. For this project of mine, she's allowed me full access to her archive along with her precious memories.
I'll never forget. A nurse was standing there as they loaded the final victim in a car, and she closed the door, and they drove off, and she said, "There goes 10 dead men."
This isn't the tale of your great-great-grandfather's ancestors' 18th century shipwreck. There are living survivors, witnesses, an entire town that still flinches from flashbacks and are triggered by memories of the time. I dedicate this account to them and all the lost souls this event claimed or left in an aftershock wave of PTSD. And with a respectful warning, I want to encourage listeners to proceed. Allow yourself this experience to be consumed with empathy and crushed by the gravity of this event that forever changed so many lives and remains the most sensitive of topics. So, if you're ready for this journey, let's get into it. It was supposed to be a typical weekday for the small town of Kingman, Arizona, a desert community along Route 66, only 80 miles southeast of Las Vegas. The day after 4th of July, fireworks had run out and family gatherings dispersed. It was one of those dry heat summer days in the desert. Working men dabbed their weeping foreheads with greasy handkerchiefs. Wives and homemakers periodically stood in front of their open freezer doors, tugging at their aprons, fanning themselves. Children were exceptionally thirsty and smelly after playing outside. It was stifling hot and stuffy, yes, but this community could never have imagined how much worse it was going to get. A rail car, number 38214, sat on a spur of the Santa Fe Railroad, which serviced and traveled through the town of Kingman. A spur is a sub-track that diverges from the main track, which provides access to industrial or commercial areas. Inside car number 38214 was 33,000 gallons of propane gas. The scene raised no red flags for civilians or the workers of the Doxel gas plant where the propane would be stored. Actually, the tank car had been sitting there for about a month since it was delivered full of propane to the plant. Amongst those with a distant view of the car were Double G Tire Company, the Country Kitchen Restaurant, and the Phillips Truck Stop, all just a few hundred feet away from rail car number 38214. Just part of the industrial town's backdrop, and most folks had no reason to consider it at all. But on July 5th, 1973, at about 1:30 p.m., with the summer heat topping 100 degrees, it was a few good men's job to consider the tank car. So they began the process of offloading the gas to be stored at the plant. Transferring propane gas, as you can imagine, isn't like stacking boxes on a dolly. Hoses are connected to valves on the railcar's hatch, and the gas is slowly siphoned out while workers monitor all angles of the procedure, checking for leaks or clogs. Incidentally, a small leak was detected in one of the fittings, but this was not the men's first rodeo, and there was no need to panic. Although a seemingly abrasive technique, it was customary to tighten such fittings with the whack of a wrench. So atop the giant rail car of flammable gas, the Doxal workers attempted to repair the leak by doing just that. A strike of a wrench, and the sound of steel on steel rang out. Once, twice, boom. A small spark from the wrench's connection with the hardware fitting ignited the leaking gas, causing an explosion. The 2 men involved in the attempted leak repair were ejected from their perch on top the rail car by the nearly 100-foot blast, and their bodies ablaze fell to the ground. Now you'll have to remember, this incident occurred on a side track of the railroad. No train station or ticket counter. These 2 men were relatively isolated in their duty that day. Not far from the explosion on the railroad was a highway patrol office. A man wearing minimal and tattered remnants of clothing was stumbling towards the station. There was smoke emitting from his charred body, and every inch of hair had been burned off of him. He was suffering and in shock, but he managed to tell an officer that his coworker was still at the explosion site. This was only the beginning of the devastation that July 5, 1973 brought to Kingman, Arizona. There would be another explosion, even bigger, but not until firefighters and hundreds of onlookers were corralled around the flaming tank car, unknowingly standing in the direct path of devastation. The events that led up to and followed the BLEVE, acronym for Boiling Liquid Expanding Vapor Explosion, killed 12, 11 who were firefighters, and injured approximately 100 citizens. The explosions, as well as the aftermath, would be studied and introduced into the teachings of firefighter academies worldwide. My name is Meg, and my interest in this story comes from a witness account of that very day. I've had the distinguished pleasure of getting to know this witness as we've built our friendship, and she's opened up her memories to me. As a hospital volunteer during the event, my friend recounts the details of July 5, 1973, and the days that followed, watching some of her closest of friends in pain and agony, and the heartbreaking reality that their small-town medical facility had to resort to begging the community for ice. Stay with us through this emotional and amazing tale. Hey guys, and welcome back to the podcast miniseries, We Need Ice: Explosion on the Railroad. Last time, we introduced the details of one explosion that occurred on July 5, 1973, in the small town of Kingman, Arizona. 2 workers of the Doxal gas plant were caught in a railcar explosion while offloading propane gas from the car to be stored at the plant. We now know the Doxal workers' attempt to repair the propane leak atop tank car number 38214 caused an explosion which killed one of the men instantly. The other worker, though badly burned and in shock, stumbled into a highway patrol office for help. That explosion was only the beginning, the precursor to the cataclysmic and deadly BLEVE of 1973. In this episode, you'll hear about the BLEVE heard round the world, an epic propane explosion that erupted in a train car while Kingman townspeople stood unknowingly and directly in the eye of a raging storm of molten metal, fire, and smoke. I'm so glad you're with me today. Let's get into it. The Kingman Fire Department consisted mostly of volunteer firefighters and no special equipment to deal with such an event and tragedy. I want to read a quote from an article on firehouse.com by Robert Burke. His words will aid in understanding why the 73 Kingman BLEVE yielded so many casualties amongst an extensively trained force of firefighters. Quote, "Protective equipment, typical for firefighters at the time, was cotton duck with wool linings and helmets made of polycarbonate plastic. This was the type of protection worn by the Kingman firefighters. It is reported that at the time of the explosion, some firefighters had full protective gear, while others wore only coats and helmets, or just coats. Those firefighters killed had the coats and their street clothes burned off of their bodies by the fire and radiant created from the explosion." End quote. I believe that article excerpt on the clothing and gear worn by the Kingman firefighters is a significant notation to make as we're leading up to the big BLEVE explosion.
What's the emergency?
The emergency call came in shortly before 2 p.m., and while a dozen or so volunteer firefighters were on the scene lickety-split, the fire had been spreading, intensifying, surrounding the propane time bomb rail car in the 100-degree desert for nearly 10 minutes. By now, townspeople were gathering around the site in a bottleneck of curiosity. You know the drill, it's simply human nature. You can't look away from something you don't see every day. Cars screeched to a halt on the side of the road. Kingman citizens dropped their schedules and appointments to stare in awe at the events happening on the railroad. Toddlers sat on the shoulders of their fathers, pointing, their eyes wide as saucers. Firefighters climbed down from their truck and aimed their hoses at railcar number 38214 in attempts to cool down the steel which entrapped 33,000 gallons of propane gas. They knew the pressure in the tank car was mounting. They needed to prevent another explosion. A Santa Fe Railroad conductor aboard another train servicing the Kingman Industries along the railroad saw smoke ahead, pluming above the very tracks he was on. He got out his camera, and his shutter clicked rapidly, capturing frame by frame his journey towards the fiery scene. When his train stopped, the conductor deboarded and joined a police officer blocking traffic along Route 66. He wanted to know how long the rail line would be blocked. But with an up-close, unrestricted view of the flaming tank car, the conductor continued photographing what he was unbelievably observing. He thought he was collecting interesting photos of a rare sight, something to share with his coworkers over cold beers possibly. He would say, "See, I was right there." He did not realize he was standing on the brink of almost certain death, photographing the inferno that would claim so many lives. While a few firemen were hosing down the tank car, others began laying a second line of hose to attach to a hydrant. It takes a lot of water to even slightly decrease the temperature of a massive steel container sizzling near 400 degrees Fahrenheit. 13 firefighters within 150 feet of railcar number 38214 were diligently working with what they had in order to control an extremely aggravated fire atop flammable propane gas. They moved swiftly, almost robotically, like when you drive to work or home, not even conscious of the route you take or turns you make or the stoplights you obey. They had a job to do. God bless them, they did their best. As the additional hose was nearly prepped and ready, at about 10 minutes after 2 p.m. and about 1,000 feet from the rail car, a perceptive policeman shouted an order to the crowd of spectators to move further back from the scene. But not a single step was taken, not a single drop of water left that second hose before the pressurized propane rail car exploded entirely. Just 19 minutes after the initial gas-ignited spark explosion critically injured one Doxel worker and killed another, the second explosion, the BLEVE, that's boiling, liquid-expanding vapor explosion, put the first one to shame. Burning metal by the ton and sprays of flaming propane rocket-launched through the air at all angles, covering a 2,000-foot distance. Can you imagine standing in the rain? No. Standing in a storm? No. Standing in a Cat 5 hurricane of flesh-mutilating debris. I'd like to quote again the Firehouse.com article by Robert Burke. Quote, "The tank broke into pieces from the force of the blast, and one half of the tank bounced end over end westward down the tracks, landing 1,200 feet from its original location on the siding. The other portion of the tank tore along the welds and flattened out on the ground. A ground-level fireball ensued and extended 150 to 200 feet in all directions from the center of the blast. This was followed by a large mushroom cloud of flame extending several hundred feet into the air, measuring 800 to 1,000 feet in diameter." End quote.
Do you remember, have you ever seen World War II, the big explosions where the mushroom clouds came down?
Yeah.
That's what it did. It was humongous.
Yeah.
And people had gone over to watch it.
Oh. It was raining like burning fuel.
Correct.
That's my friend Kay, who lived in Kingman in 73 and lived through the BLEVE of 73. Witness testimonies from survivors, not even within view of railcar number 38214, describe a thunderous roar like that of a jet airliner taking off, a mushroom cloud like that of an atomic bomb, and a shock wave like that of a world-ending earthquake. The BLEVE of July 5, 1973 was heard, seen, and felt for miles. Accounts from Kingman citizens who were driving, even several miles from the scene at the railroad, report feeling the blast and the heat like a tidal wave washing over their vehicles, melting their cars' frames. A quote from one of my interviews with a 73 Kingman, Arizona resident and witness to the events of July 5th, who wishes to remain anonymous. The call came out over the radio and we could see it from the house. The tanker would periodically shoot flames way high into the air. It was the day after the 4th of July in the summer on Route 66, and Route 66 at that time, everybody was on Route 66. If you were going to California, you were on Route 66. So you had a lot of bystanders who weren't necessarily from Kingman that were stopped and either in or out of their cars and able to witness this event. It's interesting to think about it. It really was witnessed by people and probably a memory of a lot of people who weren't just in Kingman as residents, but were there by happenstance. End quote. This witness explains the expansive reach and impact the BLEVE had on not just Kingman residents, but travelers along Route 66. In our talks, he reminds me that there are even more lives affected by this disaster than we can even imagine. They weren't even living in Kingman in 73, and probably never did. but they're out there even now, and I want to extend my deepest sympathies and support to you all. This is as good a time as any to introduce a guest who will be instrumental in telling this story.
My name is Oscar Lopez. I'm a community risk reduction specialist for the City of Kingman Fire Department. I have been affiliated with the City of Kingman Fire Department for 33 years. Started here as a volunteer firefighter in 1988, 1 year after I graduated high school. I've been basically in the fire service ever since, whether it's been through Kingman or a couple fire districts, and to the point of, a fire chief out for the Wallapai Nation Indian Reservation.
If you're doing the math, you're probably thinking Oscar isn't advanced enough in age to have a real connection to this event. But boy, would you be wrong.
Born and raised in Kingman. I did reside in Kingman during the 1973 BLEVE. Actually, we lived down the street, probably within a half mile to 3/4 of a mile from where the BLEVE actually occurred.
Oscar was only around 4 years of age in 1973, but he recalls the boom. The Kingman BLEVE is, without a doubt, one of those catastrophic happenings that lives in the memories of those young and old.
My mom babysat kids, and I remember when all this started happening, the first thing she did is she threw the couch upside down. All the kids kind of climbed inside the couch because it was kind of like a teepee at that point. We all climbed underneath there. And then all of a sudden you hear the explosion, and then it was complete quiet. Like you could hear a pin drop. My two older brothers, I remember my brothers talking about this. My one brother, he was at the park, him and his buddies looking at this whole thing, and they actually got thrown off of their bikes when the concussion of the BLEVE occurred. My other brother was on top of our garage. We had a detached garage, and it kind of had like an A-frame type roof. And he was up there with his friends looking at it, and they actually got tossed off of the garage, kind of like rolling down when the concussion of the BLEVE, kind of went out.
Another witness testimony lies in an article from the Mojave Minor newspapers I've inherited. Ambulance is Reporter's Tool During the Fire is the title, and the account is by Don Cole. This afternoon, I heard the fire whistle blow and I called the police station. They said there was a fire on Hilltop near the Whiting Brothers station, but they weren't sure what type it was. The dispatcher came back and said it was big though. As I was leaving the minor office, I heard that it was a tanker on fire and that it was really big. As I topped Hilltop, I could see the smoke and fire. I was allowed through the roadblocks, and as I approached, I could see 2 large tongues of flames reaching as high as 200 feet in the air. I rushed on, and the flames kept getting bigger. As I neared the flames, I stopped to take a picture, but as I got out of the car, I dropped my fountain pen. As I bent over to pick it up, it felt like the whole world was on fire. There was not really an explosion, but just a large roar. Everything was orange and hot, and I stayed behind the car for what seemed like forever. I remember covering my arms and face and head from the heat. I dropped my camera. It was extremely hot. Then the heat died down, and I looked up from behind the car. I had been just on the edge of the fireball that extended for maybe 2 or 3 square blocks, maybe more. There were men screaming and yelling everywhere. I pulled the car up, and there was one man lying on the pavement screaming, "Help me, God. Oh, help me, please." He was charred, something terrible. I looked around, and there was only one other man standing. Everyone else was on the ground and was screaming. The first truck was on fire and was burning badly. I ran over to the ambulance. The rubber around the outside mirror was on fire. There were 4 men around the ambulance, and all were burned badly. Chris Sanders, I could only recognize him by his voice, and he called me by name. "Oh God, someone help us," he said. He was burned all over, but still walking. I don't know how. There was no one around, so I said I would take the ambulance and take some men to the hospital. Chris helped me, and we loaded the men into the ambulance. The other man I had seen standing was a fireman, and he was burned also. He and Chris and I loaded the men into the ambulance, and I took off to the hospital. The ride was a nightmare. The men were screaming and were in bad pain. Chris Sanders stayed and helped me find the siren and other buttons on the ambulance, and we took off. The smell in the truck was unbearable. I remember getting sick and feeling like wanting to cry all the way. Chris stayed cool and comforted the other men in the ambulance. I don't know how he could even stay sane the way he was burned. At the hospital, someone met the ambulance and we unloaded the men. Chris wanted the other men helped first. He was probably burned the worst. One man had his hand on my back at the seat, and when he got out, part of his hand was stuck to the back of the seat. As soon as I unloaded them, I went back and got 2 others. I can't remember how many trips I made, but there were endless streams of men who were burned in various degrees. I found out that I had the fire department's new rescue vehicle and called on the radio. I just told the dispatcher who I was and that I was driving the ambulance. I said I didn't know the number of the vehicle or anything, but to just call me by name. Back at the scene, we covered up one man who was dead. I couldn't tell who he was because they all looked alike. They were burned so bad. They called and said they needed help transporting men to the airport, so I went out to the hospital. We took out the stretcher because it was so messed up. The inside smelled terrible. They loaded a man into the back who was covered with ice and wet towels. He was burned all over badly. We took the man out to the airport and they loaded him in an airplane to take to Phoenix. On the way back, we were in a hurry and kept the siren going. There were 9 men who needed transportation and 3 ambulances could only carry 1 or 2. The one I was driving could only carry 1 at a time, so we were in a hurry to get back. When we got back to the hospital, they had another man ready to load. There was so much happening so fast. There is much I can't remember. Mostly, I just remember seeing those men and hearing them scream and pray. Maybe it was not right sticking to my job, but I couldn't ignore those screams. It was an afternoon I'll never forget. End quote. Let me transition and talk about another special person and piece of this story. Remember my friend who I mentioned told her firsthand account of the event to me? She's a wealth of information on the Kingman BLEVE with one heck of a memory.
Burn victims are doctored with ice. And they were all on gurneys. Took them all out on the patio, which was possibly anywhere from 110 to 120 degrees that day. Kingman's hot. And they put them all outside so, the water just could run. I had Butch, Henry. They told me to wet him down from top to bottom till I was told differently.
Not just a Kingman resident and witness of July 5th, 1973, Kay was a hospital volunteer who tended to the burn victims in their early stages of extreme agony. She spares no details recollecting the incident on the railroad, which really allows us a vulnerable and accurate look at what it must have been like to experience. Should you be listening and have a connection to this event, please know every phase developing this podcast was forged with total awareness and sensitivity for you and your loved ones.
We don't want to forget them. We don't want this community to forget the 11 firefighters that gave the ultimate sacrifice protecting their community.
So I thank you for joining me throughout this true tale of tragedy, courage, pain, and community. If you're enjoying the journey, make sure to follow, like, subscribe, and review this podcast. We'd love to have you in our community.